Hey guys, so this is the next video in consciousness, which is sleep and sleep disorders is what it's centered on. Mostly, why, obviously, why we sleep, the purpose, what that means for our our consciousness, our thinking, our behaviors, all that kind of stuff. And then also this, we're going to go over some sleep disorders as well. Some of them you may have heard of, some of them you may not have. Um, but uh, but yeah, we'll get into that as well. So sleep itself is a natural, periodic, restorative state of consciousness. I know a lot of people don't think that you are conscious when you sleep, and that's partially true. I mean, medically speaking, yeah, I guess you could say you're not really conscious, but in terms of psychology, you can still, even though it's not the same level as when we are awake, we can still access our memories and we can still access our understanding and sensations and things like that. So it's not totally unconscious, but it is obviously an altered state. It's not our fully aware consciousness. Um, so when we sleep, there's really two basic types of sleep that we're in. There's what we call REM sleep, which is the sleep in which we're dreaming. This is the type of sleep where our and where we are technically dreaming, and this happens every single time we fall asleep. As long as we fall asleep for long enough, we always go into this state, and it gets its name. The REM gets its name from REM, rapid eye movement, is what it stands for. And if it, basically during this stage, our eyes are kind of constantly darting back and forth and but beneath our eyelids while we sleep, and that's where the term comes from. But it's not a fully aware conscious state, and it doesn't happen it doesn't happen constantly while we are asleep. It's only for certain periods. We'll get into that more in just a minute. But and then also there's non-REM sleep, or non-rapid eye movement sleep, and this is the sleep where we are pretty quiet, I guess you could say, quote unquote quiet. And this is really when our brain activity is lowered. Our brain activity is it's not it's not inactive, but it's much slower than when we are awake, and it's very what word am I looking for? It's much less active than if we were consciously aware of what's happening and awake. So, and that's divided into some stages as well. And I'll get into that more in just a minute. So, just real quick, there's a couple different theories about why we sleep. The two that have kind of prevailed over time is the restoration theory and the adaptive theory. And the restoration theory just says that we sleep because it rejuvenates our mind, it rejuvenates our body, it allows us to continue to survive, um, and be able to function normally and without any type of disruption to our consciousness. It restores our mental and brain functions. REM sleep restores our mental and brain functions, and then non-REM sleep restores our physical functions, our bodily functions. Um, and obviously, if you've ever been awake for a very long amount of time, you know that you feel physically drained and you also feel mentally drained. But then when you sleep, you tend to be restored in those areas. So that's where that theory comes from. And then also the adaptive theory, and this is more of kind of has more of an evolutionary perspective to it. The adaptive theory says that we sleep because, or that our sleep patterns as human beings evolved because it allowed us to conserve energy, which allowed us to survive. But then also it allowed us to avoid dangerous predators that were out at night. So we basically, what it says is we sleep at night because that is a more dangerous time uh, for us as human beings, or at least evolutionarily speaking, it's more dangerous. And therefore we sleep at night to avoid uh, danger that could lead to us not surviving. So it's an adaptive, it's an evolutionary um, evolutionary reason as to why we sleep. Um, so just to so moving straight into the stages of sleep. I'm sorry. So to move into the stages of sleep, we there are a couple different stages that we go into as we start to sleep more and more or longer and longer. So stage one is what we would kind of call the in between stage. It's the stage where you're not fully asleep, but you're also not fully conscious either. And a couple different things can happen in this stage. First of all, you as you fall into these stages, you have physiological changes that are associated with it. Your heart rate slows, your breathing slows, your blood pressure decreases as you fall into sleep, but it slows beginning in stage one. The biggest difference in stage one as compared to others is that you can still have kind of these false sensations and hallucinations during stage one. I like to call these kind of the falling sensations, and I've unfortunately, I know you'll find this very hard to believe, but I have had kids fall asleep in class while I'm going over stuff, and um, every once in a while I'll have somebody who wakes up violently, and I'll ask them, hey, did it feel like you were falling? And they always were like, yeah, I feel like I was falling out of my chair, and that's a characteristic of stage one. And so a couple of years ago, I had this kid who just he constantly fell asleep, and he would wake up every once in a while, kind of violently, and everybody in the class would kind of just joke like, "Oh, that's stage one," and it was kind of a running joke with him. But um, also another example of this would be like, if you've ever kind of fallen asleep with the TV on, you're not. You may remember a period where you're kind of awake or kind of asleep, but you can still hear the TV and you can still hear what's happening, and you're not fully knocked out. So like that's kind of stage one as well. Like you're still kind of aware of what's happening, but not totally asleep yet. So it's kind of an in between stage. And also our brain waves, and I'll get more into this in just a minute, but our brain waves change as we go from stage to stage, and that's usually what dictates whether we're in stage one, stage two, whatever. Um, an example of this would be if our brain waves change from what's called beta waves, which is the waves that are present when we're awake. They go into alpha waves, and like I said, I'll get more into the process of brain waves changing here in just a minute. But our brain waves switch from from beta waves to alpha waves during this first stage. Stage two, usually only about 15-20 minutes. This is when we're starting to get into deep sleep. We're not really aware anymore of what's happening um, uh, in our external world. So we're not aware of the TV that's on, or we've moved past the hallucinations and the false sensations that we might have in stage one. And this is when we start to have what's called sleep spindles. And sleep spindles are random bursts of activity, of rapid brain activity. And this usually only tends to happen in stage two. Um, because it's like a burst of activity before we enter deep sleep, which is stage three. Um, and also our brain waves switch from what's alpha waves to theta waves. And again, I'll show you what these brain waves look like here in just a minute. But um, again, we've gone from beta to alpha in stage one, and we go from alpha into theta waves in stage two. And then when we get into stage three, this is what we call deep sleep. This is when it's very, very difficult to wake us up. Obviously not, a lot of people are really deep sleepers. I am one of those individuals. Once I fall asleep, it is very difficult to wake me up. But even the person who is a light sleeper, if they are in stage three, it is very difficult to wake them up, because this is when you have your brain waves are at the lowest activity. You are the least aware of what is happening around you. Your blood pressure, your breathing, your heart rate are all super low, and therefore it is very difficult to wake you up. Um, it's not impossible, but it's just very difficult. And if you wake up during this stage, and again, if you think back to stage one, stage two, those are only about 10, 15 minutes each. So if you take if you take an hour and a half nap, and your alarm goes off, and you do happen to or you do happen to wake up during stage three, you feel terrible when you wake up during, because you feel very groggy. You feel like your body is just very heavy, and and that's because you woke up in a stage that is normally reserved for restoring your body and restoring your physical functions, and you're not meant to wake up during that stage. So it's always very difficult to kind of come out of that stage, if it happens. And then if you move into REM sleep, which, like I said earlier, this is the stage where your eyes are constantly moving back and forth, and this is where dreaming occurs. Um, you know, you tend to enter into REM sleep. So, and I'll show you a chart here in just a minute, but basically what happens is you tend to go from awake to stage one to stage two to stage three, and then go to stage two again. And then instead of going back into stage one, which is, kind of that in between stage when we're awake and asleep, we enter in what's called REM sleep. And again, REM sleep is, like I said, where we're dreaming, when our mind is very, very active, our memories are being accessed. And the next PowerPoint, the next video is going to be focused on dreaming and dream theories and things like that. And we'll get more into like why we dream and how we dream. But just know that this is where that dreaming occurs, is during REM sleep. And I'll, again, like I said, I'll show you a chart here in just a minute that kind of shows you. So sometimes if you read in the textbooks and things like that, you'll hear REM sleep referred to as what's called paradoxical sleep. And if you know a paradox, it's something that's kind of just a contradiction or a weird kind of unexplainable thing. And that's kind of what REM sleep is, because our mind is super active. Our eyes are darting back and forth. We're accessing memories. We're experiencing sensations. But on the flip side of that, our body is sort of paralyzed. Our body isn't moving while we're dreaming. So for example, if we're dreaming about running or jumping or whatever, our body isn't doing that. We're not trying to run. We're not trying to jump. We're not trying to swing our arms or whatever, because our body is paralyzed, but we're still kind of experiencing it physically. If you've ever woken up from a dream, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow or with the next video. If you've ever woken up from a dream that's very scary or stressful or whatever, that you're sweating, you're breathing hard, that's because you physically experience those same things as if you were awake, but our body isn't actually going through them. We're not actually running or screaming or whatever like we wouldn't be in the dream. So, we REM sleep, it's interesting because we're experiencing all those things in our mind, but physically our body is not actually going through all that. And REM sleep is interesting also because we need more of it when we're younger and less of it when we're older. When we are infants and toddlers and small children, we need more REM sleep, which lines up with that theory of the restorative theory, which says that REM sleep develops our brain and our cognitive functions, which is obviously when we're infants and toddlers, that's when our brain is developing more rapidly. So that lines up with that. But then as we get older, we tend to dream less as we get older. We tend to be in REM sleep less, which it's not necessarily saying we dream less overall, because we tend to sleep less as we get older as well. But in terms of the sleep we have, it tends to be a little less active when it comes to REM sleep as we get older. So anyway, so this during a typical night of sleep, we tend to cycle through those stages, stage 2, 3, and then REM sleep pretty constantly. We tend to enter REM sleep longer as we get closer to waking up. And that kind of makes sense. If usually when you wake up from a dream, you tend to wake up from a dream closer to when you normally wake up. And that's usually because you've been in that dream longer than the dreams you had earlier in the night, because REM sleep gets longer as we continue to sleep throughout the night. And so we tend to have more deep sleep up front and then more REM sleep at the back part of our sleep cycles each night. The longer we sleep each night, the more we enter REM sleep. One interesting thing with REM sleep is called REM rebound, and this is if you've ever pulled an all-nighter or stayed up way later than you're not, you normally do, or you've been sleep deprived, this has probably happened to you. And all REM rebound is that if we are deprived of sleep, and then the next time we fall asleep, then our body tends to enter REM sleep much quicker. We may go straight into REM sleep instead of deep sleep. We tend to catch up on that REM sleep that we've been deprived of. Um, I full disclosure, when I was in college, I pulled a couple of all-nighters for exams and writing papers and things like that. And I remember it kind of sticks out to me looking back that when I fell asleep after those times, I remember having some pretty crazy dreams, and it was because I went straight into kind of REM sleep, and I had more REM sleep than in those periods than I normally would, because I was so sleep deprived. Speaking of sleep deprivation, obviously talking to teenagers and high school students about sleep deprivation is, I get it. Let's just put it that way. But the more that you deprive yourself of a normal night's sleep, and especially REM sleep, then there will be certain bodily effects. You see there at the bottom, obviously fatigue is the obvious one. You're much more sluggish and lethargic as the more REM sleep you were deprived of. And then obviously it's harder to concentrate. You're usually more emotional. I know that I am very guilty of this. I just ask my wife, if I don't get a lot of sleep, I tend to be pretty cranky and irritable. It's also easier to get sick. Your immune system needs sleep to function at a high rate. So it's easy, if you lose sleep, you tend to get sick quicker than you normally would. Obviously, if you deprive yourself of sleep long enough, your body will shut down. And unfortunately, there has been people who have tried to set records for the longest amount of time awake, and almost every time that person has had very severe health consequences. I'm not sure if any of them have actually died as a result, but there have been some pretty severe health consequences. So this is that chart I was telling you about. So let me see if I can, let me highlight these things here. So right here, so this top chart is young adults. This would probably be adolescents. So what it's saying is right here, when you're awake, um, you obviously, as you fall into stage one, here, and then stage, two here, and then you're in stage three for a while, and then you see it goes to two, and then it skips over one and goes right back here to REM sleep. And as you see, you tend to repeat that same process, but then eventually throughout the night, right here is mostly where I'm talking about, like in this area here, you're no longer entering into stage three, and you're just having longer and longer REM sleep. And if you look at this chart here at the bottom, you can see that you may, and also one thing, you may wake up at points during the night, like right here and right here. And what that's saying is that it's very common to wake up during the night. You may have to use the bathroom or whatever, but it happens few and far between when you're younger. And then the older you get, and I can speak to this as an adult now, not an older adult, mind you, but I'm an adult now, and I wake up more during the night now than I ever did when I was younger. And that's what this chart is showing, is that you see here, you tend to have less deep sleep, maybe not as much REM sleep either, but you're waking up more throughout the night. So that's one example there. So this is just a kind of a chart to help you remember the brainwave pattern, and just know that beta waves here. This is when you're awake, and then you go beta, alpha, theta, delta, BATD, BATD is kind of how I remember that acronym. It doesn't mean anything per se, but BATD, beta, alpha, theta, delta. Beta's awake, alpha stage one, theta stage two, delta stage three, and then REM sleep is kind of its own separate thing. All right, so real quick, I'm probably going to run over my normal time with this. I want to go through these. So there are a bunch of different sleep disorders. Insomnia is probably the most common. Um, insomnia has there's this myth that insomnia is only when you are not able to fall asleep. But insomnia is also not being able to stay asleep, or it's waking up way too early, and not being able to fall back asleep. That's also characteristics of insomnia. Sleep apnea is also pretty common, mostly in people with weight problems. Uh, Usually, this is someone who has very loud snoring. Their breathing is irregular while they sleep, and usually they wake up gasping, or they wake up as if they're having to gasp for air. And what happens when you're in sleep, when you have sleep apnea, is your airway actually closes while you are asleep, and then you tend to it doesn't open back up until your body needs that air. So that's where the irregular breathing and the snoring comes into play. And a lot of people are able to treat this various ways, but the most common way to deal with this is through a CPAP machine, which it keeps the airway open while you're asleep, and keeps that breathing and the stoppage in breathing and snoring from happening. So that's one way. Sleepwalking um, tends to be more common in children than adults, but it can happen with adults. And this isn't waking up and just kind of being halfway awake or whatever when you wake up. Like, this is literally like moving while you are technically in stage 3 or stage 2 sleep. Um, but usually most of us have probably had um, an episode of sleepwalking at some point in our lives, but yeah, it's much more common in children than adults. And then also narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is kind of a myth. Like, some people think narcolepsy is like you literally just like you don't know what's happening, you just fall asleep. But narcolepsy is chronic sleep attacks. I actually have it's one of my wife's friends. Her husband suffers from narcolepsy, and his isn't very, very severe. He takes medication for it, and he doesn't really, basically he just doesn't drive like super long distances to make sure that he doesn't have an attack or whatever. But the really severe narcoleptic cases can be completely out of nowhere. Like, someone can just be walking or talking and just fall asleep. We don't really know why. We don't really know where it comes from, but it can happen. And then night terrors are uh, when if you've ever had, this isn't the same thing as a nightmare. A night terror is extreme anxiety and a panic, and you don't know why. You just wake up incredibly panicked and anxious, screaming sometimes, sweating, and you don't really know why. Like, usually when you wake up from a nightmare, like, why um, you're scared or anxious or whatever. With night terrors, you don't know. You just wake up screaming, or you wake up sweating, and all this stuff that's associated with nightmares, but you have no understanding why, and it's very difficult. And it usually happens more with children. I've had a couple of students over the years say they've suffered from night terrors in the past, but it's scary. And we don't really know exactly why it happens, but it is a sleep disorder as well. And that's an assignment that you are not doing right now, obviously. So I'll get off of that. All right, so that's the second set of notes for Unit 5. So the next set will be on dreaming and dream theories, and get into some Freudian stuff again. If you've missed Sigmund, he'll be back in the next episode. So look forward to that. See you guys there.